37 ships stuck off the coast of Iran, and none of them moving. Not because of a storm, not because of mechanical failure, but because of something far more calculated. A blockade that isn't officially a blockade. A stranglehold that operates in the shadows. And here's the thing that matters. This invisible pressure is reshaping how sanctions actually work in the modern world. Stay with me, because once you see how this works, you can't unsee it. So here's what we're going to figure out together. First, how does a country with the world's fourth largest oil reserves run out of storage in 22 days? Second, why is Russia, supposedly Iran's closest ally, refusing to help even as Tehran's foreign minister begs in person? And third, why are former regime loyalists, the people who built this entire system, suddenly the ones leading the protests? We'll get to all three. But to make sense of any of it, you need to understand one specific thing about how Iran's economy was actually structured. And it's not what most analysts tell you. Look, Iran's oil industry doesn't exist in isolation. It's connected to every other part of the economy through a single critical choke point, the Strait of Hormuz. That narrow waterway moves roughly 30% of the world's oil. For Iran, it's not just important, it's existential. Every dollar Iran makes from oil exports flows through that strait. Every tanker, every barrel, every transaction depends on those waters staying open. Now, in 2015, when the nuclear deal happened, Iran's oil exports were supposed to flood back into the global market. Sanctions were lifted, ports were reopened, and for a moment, it looked like Iran's economy was about to breathe again. But here's what actually happened. Iran's oil industry never really recovered the way the regime promised. Production stayed flat. Export capacity never returned to pre-sanction levels. And when the U.S. pulled out of the nuclear deal in 2018 and reimposed sanctions, Iran's situation didn't just go backward, it collapsed. By 2023, Iran was producing less oil than it had in decades. Storage tanks were filling up, export routes were being choked off, and the regime's explanation? They blamed external pressure. They blamed the Americans, they blamed the Europeans. What they didn't say was that their own mismanagement, their own corruption, their own inability to modernize had already hollowed out the industry from the inside. That's the context. Now watch what happens next. In late February, something shifted, not dramatically at first, but the signals were unmistakable. A handful of international shipping companies started refusing to pick up Iranian oil, not because of a formal ban, not because of an official announcement, but because the insurance costs had become prohibitive. The legal risks had become too high. The complexity of moving Iranian oil through international waters had become economically irrational, and once one company pulls back, others follow. That's how shadow sanctions work. No formal declaration, no official decree, just the slow grinding pressure of economic reality making something impossible without anyone officially making it impossible. Within weeks, the effect was visible. Iranian tankers were sitting empty at port, storage facilities were reaching capacity, and the regime was facing a choice that no oil-dependent government wants to face. Either find new buyers willing to absorb the legal and financial risk, or watch your most valuable export become worthless in your own tanks. Iran tried to find alternatives. They reached out to China. They reached out to Russia. They reached out to anyone who might take their oil without triggering secondary sanctions. And here's where the story takes a turn that the regime didn't anticipate. Russia said no, not maybe, not eventually, just no. And that's the part that matters. Because Russia, according to the narrative the Iranian regime had been selling to its own people, was supposed to be Iran's strategic partner. The country that would stand shoulder to shoulder with Tehran when the West turned up the pressure, the ally that would absorb Iranian oil, help Iran weather the sanctions, and prove that Iran wasn't isolated. Instead, Russia looked at the situation and decided it had better things to do with its limited shipping capacity. Russia's own oil was being sanctioned. Russia's own tankers were being seized. Russia's own shadow fleet was under constant pressure from NATO interception operations. So Russia wasn't going to add Iranian oil to its logistics nightmare. Russia was going to protect its own interests, and Iran was left holding the bag. That decision, Russia's refusal to help, was the moment everything changed. Because it shattered a foundational assumption that the Iranian regime had been building its entire post-2018 strategy on. The assumption that when things got bad, the axis of resistance would hold, that China and Russia would step in, that Iran wouldn't be alone. But Iran was alone, and the regime knew it. And the people of Iran knew it. And that's when the real pressure started building. Storage facilities hit 90% capacity, then 95%. Then they were essentially full, and Iran was still producing oil that had nowhere to go. The regime had a few options, none of them good. Option 1, cut production. That means laying off workers, closing refineries, and admitting to the Iranian people that the economy was contracting. Option 2, sell the oil at a massive discount to whoever would take it, further degrading the regime's revenue. Option 3, keep producing and hope something changes. But something wasn't going to change. The shipping companies weren't going to reverse course. Russia wasn't going to reverse course. The legal and financial pressures weren't going to disappear. So the regime chose option 4, the one they didn't announce. They started preparing for economic collapse. And that's when the protests started. Not because of a single trigger, not because of a specific event, but because the Iranian people could see what was happening. They could see the storage facilities. They could see the tankers sitting idle. They could see the regime's attempts to find buyers failing. They could see that Russia wasn't coming to help. And they understood what that meant. It meant the regime had lost control of the situation. It meant the economy was about to crater. It meant that the promises made in 2015 that sanctions relief would bring prosperity were never going to be kept. And for a population that had already endured decades of economic mismanagement, that was the breaking point. Now here's the part that really matters. The protests weren't led by young radicals or Western-backed opposition groups. They were led by former regime insiders, by people who had built the system, by people who understood exactly how deep the rot went, because they had helped create it. And when they started speaking publicly, when they started saying that the regime's economic strategy had failed, that the regime's reliance on Russia and China was a mistake, that the regime had squandered the nuclear deal opportunity, that's when the government realized it had a legitimacy crisis on its hands. You can suppress foreign opposition. You can dismiss external critics. But when the people who built your system start saying it's broken, that's a different kind of threat. That's a threat from inside. The regime's response was predictable: arrests, censorship, attempts to control the narrative. But you can't control what people see with their own eyes. You can't control the reality that oil is sitting in tanks with nowhere to go. You can't control the reality that your supposed allies have abandoned you. You can't control the reality that the economic model you've been defending for 5 years has collapsed in a matter of weeks. And so the protests have continued, and they've grown. And the regime is now facing something it hasn't faced in years: genuine, widespread, internally driven pressure for change. What's happening in Iran right now is what happens when a government's external strategy fails and its internal legitimacy collapses at the same time. The sanctions didn't destroy Iran's economy. The regime's own decisions did. The refusal to diversify, the refusal to modernize, the refusal to acknowledge that the post-2018 strategy wasn't working. And when Russia, the supposed lifeline, refused to help, the entire structure came apart. Not because of a military intervention, not because of a coup, but because the economic foundation gave way, and the people of Iran are now living through the consequences. Now, if you've made it this far, you already understand something that most people will completely miss about how modern sanctions actually function. This isn't about formal restrictions or official decrees. It's about the slow, grinding pressure of economic reality making something impossible without anyone officially making it impossible. That's worth knowing. That's worth a subscribe. It tells me to keep breaking down how the world actually works instead of how governments say it works. Drop a comment if this reframes how you think about sanctions, because I read them. Here's where it gets even more interesting. The same mechanism that's destroying Iran's economy right now is being used in different ways across the globe. Against Russia's shadow fleet in the Baltic, against Venezuelan oil exports, against Chinese tech companies trying to access Western markets. The pattern is identical. Create enough legal and financial friction that companies voluntarily withdraw. Create enough uncertainty that insurance becomes prohibitively expensive. Create enough complexity that the cost of doing business exceeds the profit. And suddenly, without a formal blockade, without a formal sanction, without a formal anything, the system stops working. For Iran, the immediate consequence is clear. The regime will either have to dramatically reform its economic strategy, or it will continue to face mounting internal pressure. The storage crisis will eventually resolve itself, either through production cuts or through finding new buyers, however desperate those buyers might be. But the damage to the regime's legitimacy is done. The myth that Russia and China will always have Iran's back has been shattered. And the Iranian people have learned something that no amount of propaganda can undo. Their government's strategic choices have consequences, and those consequences are falling on them. The strategic consequence over the next 12 months is even more significant. As Iran's economy contracts, as the regime's credibility erodes, as the pressure from internal opposition grows, Iran becomes less stable, less predictable, more likely to make desperate moves in the region. We've already seen signs of this: increased drone and missile attacks, attempts to destabilize Gulf shipping, provocations against Israel. When a government feels cornered, when it feels its legitimacy slipping away, it often lashes out. And a cornered Iran with nothing to lose is a threat not just to its own people, but to the entire region. What becomes impossible now is the regime's narrative of strategic partnership with Russia and China. That story is over. It died the moment Russia refused to help absorb Iranian oil. And what becomes inevitable is continued internal pressure for change. The regime can suppress it temporarily, the regime can arrest protesters, the regime can control the media, but it cannot make oil disappear from storage tanks. It cannot make the economic reality go away. And it cannot force Russia to care about Iran's problems when Russia has its own survival to worry about. So here's the real question, and I want you to think about it. If a country's supposed allies abandon it the moment things get difficult, what does that tell you about the stability of that alliance system? Because that's what's happening right now, not just in Iran, but across the entire non-Western world. Countries that thought they had partners are discovering that those partnerships are conditional, that they only work when times are good. And when times get hard, when real sacrifice is required, the partners disappear. That realization is reshaping geopolitics in ways we're only beginning to understand, and it's still in motion.